Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the final panel's discussion of this two-day conference. Thank you for being here and staying until the end. My name is Corey from Quantum Data Center Advisory, and I'd like to introduce my panel here. First, we have Marianne Rechik. She's partner at SGT Capital, a boutique private equity firm. She's also on the advisory board member of Utimaco, a cybersecurity provider. She specializes in private equity, digital infrastructure, and the impact of global policy shifts on investment strategies in Asia. We also have Jake Robson, who is the Asia head of corporate and M&A at leading international firm Greenberg Traurig, and has been based in the region for 20 years. He specializes in complex cross-border transactions and fundraising in the digital infrastructure space. And lastly, we have Joel Shen, who is the head of technology and venture capital for Asia and a partner at Withers Worldwide. He leads the firm's Indonesia practice and technology and venture capital practices for Asia. So without further ado, let's begin the session. We've just 2 weeks into the conclusion of the US elections, where we're seeing Trump commencing his second term as the President of the United States. So in light of this, panelists, how might the ongoing US-China tech rivalry impact investment flows and tech partnerships in the APAC digital infrastructure sector? Marianne, please.
Okay, so I will start by saying that data center infrastructure is extremely complex, and the supply chain is really interdependent and runs across many borders globally. And so let me start with some statistics. NVIDIA is absolutely crucial for data center GPUs, and in 2023 it captured 98% of the revenue from the data center GPUs. NVIDIA is a fabless company, which means it does not produce any of its own product, really. It designs it, but it doesn't produce it. And it is 100% dependent on those who can, which is TSMC and Samsung. But TSMC has 90% of the global production market for chips that are 4nm and 3nm, Samsung less than 10. And none of this is produced domestically in the US. Intel produces about 12% of the supply of chips into the US, and that's produced domestically in the US. But this is 7nm and more, which is not something that can be used for GPUs for data centers. So TSMC is the king for the data centers, and it's absolutely essential for NVIDIA to make the products available to actually run the data centers as we want them to run, and certainly very important for AI because no one else can produce this other than TSMC right now. So where do we stand? TSMC, as you know, is Taiwanese. It has attempted to go into the US. There was a CHIPS Act which was passed in 2020, and it has taken a long time to roll out because of a number of bureaucratic issues. But as of a couple of months ago, it has been confirmed that TSMC has received $6.6 billion US to actually start the production of 3nm in Arizona, US. This is a subsidy that has not yet actually been paid to it, and the facilities have not yet been opened in the US, and they are slated to start operation by the end of 2025. CHIPS Act, as you may have heard, Speaker Johnson announced a couple of weeks ago, actually it was called a hot mic rather than announcing it, that it will be repealed. And if it is repealed, there will be no subsidies for the local production of chips in the US. Why is this important? Well, Trump has already announced that he will be introducing tariffs, 10 to 20% of everything that's produced outside of the US, and up to 60% or maybe even more on everything that's produced in China. NVIDIA designs its chips inside the US, then they are produced by TSMC in Taiwan, and in order to be assembled into the NVIDIA's H100 chips and Blackwell chips, which have been halted because of some overheating issues, I think, NVIDIA relies on two companies. One is called Amkor, which is US headquartered, but nothing is done in the US. It's done in Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, and China. And the other one is ASE, which is a Taiwanese company, again, that has factories outside of China, outside of Taiwan, I should not have said that, but also in China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Japan. So NVIDIA doesn't produce anything locally, which means that it will be really hardly hit with the tariffs if they are introduced as planned. So what does it mean for the data centers? Well, you know, I had agonized over this over the last couple of weeks, and it seems to me, and obviously it's something that, you know, we can just speculate at this stage, but it seems to me that it really is the domestic data centers in the US that will suffer the most with the tariffs if they are introduced as they are, but that this leaves a great opportunity for this region to seize on capturing some of that overflow or relocation of the data centers from the US to other regions, so that NVIDIA can actually provide the GPUs as they have been without tariffs. There are some issues with this. Obviously, China is wanting to increase its productions. There are restrictions in place. US has exerted its power, and you know, TSMC and Samsung are not allowed to sell anything less than 7nm to the Chinese-based companies. ASML, which is a company that produces extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is essential for the production of the top-end chips. They're not allowed to sell this EUV to China, and the deep ultraviolet is not enough, it's just not advanced enough for the Chinese company SMIC to actually produce anything less than 7nm in China. So supply chain will be disrupted. Chinese companies will not be able to come in and bridge the gap quickly enough, but I think this creates a really good opportunity for this region.
It's interesting you mentioned tariffs, Marion, because just this week at the G20, President Xi Jinping of China went the complete opposite direction, didn't he, than the US, and announced that China would be charging zero tariffs for all less developed countries with whom China has diplomatic relations. And I think that takes us to the wider observation that in times of escalating geopolitical conflict, and I'll share a little bit of perspective on Indonesia here, because it's using the batik shirt, that it's a topic near and dear to my heart. Middle powers like Indonesia tend to be beneficiaries. We've seen this happen, you know, as far back as the Cold War, when US was extending aid to Indonesia. We've seen it happen more recently with the Chinese Belt and Road project. Some of you will have experience taking the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, built, financed completely by China, on Chinese technology, that reduces what was previously a 3.5-hour car ride to a 29-minute commute. You've now had 2 days of talking about data centers. I'm going to illustrate this point with something completely unrelated to data centers, and some of you will be familiar with this brand of instant noodles called Indomie. Some of you will have had it today. It's arguably Indonesia's most famous export, and many of you will wonder why Indonesia, who is not a producer of wheat, is, you know, one of the world's largest exporters of instant noodles. That's because about 60 years ago, in 1966, at the height of the Vietnam War, the background music to my narrative, President Lyndon Johnson approved a Food for Peace program that effectively offered $300 million of food aid to Indonesia. Indonesian president at the time, President Suharto, requested for the aid to be provided in rice, which was the staple of the Indonesian people. And US just didn't have enough of it, but it had wheat and bulgur in stockpiles. So President Suharto then went on a long campaign to change the Indonesian diet. So you know, while rice today remains a staple, wheat in the form of noodles is also very much featured in the Indonesian diet. In fact, in 1966, per capita consumption of wheat per annum was about 0.3 kilograms, and today it's 32 kilograms. So it increased by 100x since then. right? And you're sort of just using this as an analogy to illustrate the broader point of we are going to see increasing competition. We are going to see US and China ingratiating themselves, projecting power into this part of the world.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, if we take it down to the level below maybe the macro level, the level that I tend to get involved in, where I'm seeing these frictions play out, I advise on both the operators and the developers developing the data centers. And whereas 3 or 4 years ago the supply chain issues were not nearly as obvious as they are today, they're a real issue. And so all the developers and the operators looking to plan for the future developments, or even the developments currently at an early stage, they're having to factor in the significant delays, not just the glamorous stuff like the GPUs, and there are obviously export restrictions from the US on GPUs into Asia, and there are various countries, quasi-blacklist countries, where it is almost impossible to import GPUs into under US restrictions, export restrictions. It's not just the glamorous kind of the high-tech stuff, it's the basic stuff, it's the generators, it's the water cooling machinery. There are massive delays in all of this, and this is factoring now into the way these kind of development deals are negotiated. The risk allocation, who bears the risk of a delay? Is it the developer? Is it the financer? Is it the ultimate tenant, the hyperscaler? And there's a huge kind of battle going on, as you know, in my day-to-day job, I'm advising on that battle as to how you apportion that risk and how you make sure that, in my case, my client isn't going to be prejudiced by an unforeseen delay that has nothing to do with its efficiency or lack of efficiency. It's purely to do with global supply chain. So it's obviously very significant on a macro level, and I would agree it's very much going to be a delineation between the West and China, and in particular the US. And it's worth noting actually that I don't think Trump is going to change things massively as far as that friction is concerned. I don't think it's going to make it any better. I don't think it's going to make it significantly worse. It's a pretty bad shape at the moment. Biden has been the most aggressive president, I think, in history as far as Chinese approach to China is concerned. I think Trump will continue that, maybe make it slightly more difficult. But I don't see that as getting materially worse. It's already at a very bad stage. I think it'll factor through and flow through into the actual day-to-day job of developing data centers and building this capacity. That's where it'll have more of an impact. And we focused on the kind of the high level, the GPU side of things. You look at the kind of the basic stuff. The big manufacturers in the data center of the equipment, the Huawei's, for example. Huawei is now quasi-blacklisted as far as the US is concerned. So any of the data center operators, and a lot of them are PE-backed with US PE funds behind them, are getting more and more nervous about anything that touches Huawei, whether it's to do with a risk of technology bits being stolen or being tapped into, or even purely passive equipment like generators. There's no real risk there. It's just the association with Huawei that it is already at a very, very bad stage. I suspect that may get even worse. And so we are going to see a big problem, which is going to get exacerbated, not just at the high end, but also at the low end, I think.
Just to add really quickly, speaking of Huawei, only 10 days ago, TSMC was busted because a 4nm chip was found in Huawei's AI operating system. And so obviously the sanctions were reiterated, and the jury's out as to what's going to happen, whether there will be any consequences for TSMC. Presumably not, because it's such an important, player in this market. But someone mentioned in panels before that there are ways around this. There are ways of not directly selling the product to the Chinese companies, but perhaps using a third-party contractor. It seems that US is actually keeping an eye on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe pick up on that point very quickly. The suggestion that because these chips aren't necessarily GPUs, again we're talking about here, aren't produced in the US, they're produced in Taiwan or wherever, but so Samsung in Korea. Does that mean that the US can effectively prevent them being exported to China or even through a third country to China? The answer very definitively is yes, they can. The US is powerful enough and has a history of imposing its will as far as whether it's laws. Anti-corruption law is a great example. The US has imposed the FCPA, which is an anti-corruption, purely US anti-corruption law, and it's made it basically globally recognized by enforcing it outside the US. And the US will very, very actively, and it already is very actively enforcing these things. So if the question is, oh, can we route it through a third party and kind of have some kind of funky kind of arrangement whereby there's no direct transfer of the GDP to China, can you get around it that way? The answer is almost invariably absolutely not without risk. You can try to do it if you want to, but you'd be very brave to risk sanctions or enforcement by the US DOJ.
Thank you for your insights. Trump's been looking to invest more into or ramp up US oil production, and this has implications on climate imperatives, not just in the data center space, but also in other sectors that have to do with energy. So Southeast Asia has always been constrained in its energy production, and data centers are taking up an increasing proportion of the supply. We discussed how renewable energy and perhaps nuclear power can address energy demands while highlighting the regulatory hurdles of policy frameworks required to enable these transitions.
Again, the previous panel touched on some of these areas, so I'll try not to cover the same areas that were covered in the previous panel. We are reaching an inflection point, as far as I can tell, as far as energy supply is concerned. Data centers are increasingly producing exponentially larger amounts of energy. Now, as the previous panel had said, AI is obviously one of the drivers for that. AI could also potentially be the solution to it, so we could use AI to try and make that a far more efficient way of using energy. The concern is that there aren't many obvious examples as to how that energy supply can be ramped up quickly, and I think it does need to be ramped up quickly. There's going to be a policy approach. Obviously, governments are going to have to appreciate that the energy supply, the state-owned energy providers are going to probably already pretty much reaching the capacity, and they're certainly going to be stretched well beyond that in the next 5 years. And so there needs to be some very, very urgent policy decisions taken at the government level. Again, touching on one of the things that was raised by the last panel, it's also going to be private industry that needs to do that. What I have begun to see, and I expect to be seeing a bit more probably in the next 2 or 3 years, are partnerships between the data center operators or developers and renewable energy sponsors, trying to co-develop captive kind of renewable energy projects next to a data center, co-locating them. It's incredibly difficult to do, incredibly expensive to do, and there needs to be certainly a drive, a policy drive, carrot and stick approach from policy. So the stick being the threat of moratoriums like Singapore had imposed a few years ago if you're not seen to be energy efficient enough or not relying heavily enough on renewable energy. And there's the carrot approach, which is the subsidies or the incentives to develop increasing amounts of renewable energy. So I think that is, we're at an inflection point now and a crunch point where I think that decision policy-wise has to be made, and from a private perspective, from a private participants' perspective, we're going to need to see some more of these kind of JVs or arrangements. At the moment, we're at the early stage where the focus has just been on energy efficiency, focus on the PUE, just the easy stuff, I suppose. We're now at the stage where we've got beyond the easy stuff. We're going to have to focus on a far more fundamental issue, which is, at the moment, the amount of renewable energy that is provided to the data center is minuscule, absolutely minuscule, and it's going to need to ramp up very, very significantly. And it's very difficult and very expensive to do, but it's going to happen.
I have a slightly more cynical view when it comes to Indonesia. You've identified the problem that there will be an uptick in terms of capacity and the need for power generation, clean power generation, but I personally don't see that happening in Indonesia. Indonesia's got a supply a capacity overhang when it comes to power, most of which is generated by coal. And coal still remains the cheapest source of power in Indonesia. people dig it out of the ground, in some cases they pick it off the ground. You know, so who's going to invest, you know, large amounts of capex building a renewable, you know, geothermal plant next to a power station, right? And don't get me wrong, I mean, Indonesia sits on Pacific Ring of Fire. It's the world's largest repository of geothermal energy. So the solution appears quite elegant in Indonesia's case, right? Decommission all of the coal-fired power plants and, you know, put deep geothermal power plants into the ground. Unfortunately, it's not happened. Some of you will remember that a couple of years ago, when Indonesia presided over the G20 and hosted the G20 delegates in Bali, Indonesia also announced what was at the time, and I believe still today remains, the largest climate finance deal in history, the Just Energy Transition Plan, where a group of developing economies and multinationals led by the US pledged $20 billion to help Indonesia transition to renewable energies. 2 years in, wouldn't want to say not a dime, but very little of that money has been dispersed. So, you know, is there a problem looming on the horizon? I think there is. Is there the political will, the stick and carrot, as you say, to address that problem in the way that you've just described? I'm slightly skeptical, but, you know, people have been surprised by Indonesia before, so let's see.
Joel, you're very sceptical. I'm slightly more optimistic. I think even in Indonesia, again, if we take a theme from two of the previous panelists from Microsoft and Google, it's going to be driven by the hyperscalers. It's going to be driven by big tech, whether it's US big tech or to a certain extent Chinese big tech. And these guys all have stakeholders, and the stakeholders are all insisting that they need to be more efficient, they need to be more reliant on renewable energy. And when you get these massive organizations who are investing billions and billions in an economy, they have an ability to certainly not dictate policy, but certainly have a pretty strong influence over policy. So I would absolutely agree with you. Indonesia to date has been very, very slow to adopt that side of things. I think that over the next 4 or 5 years, my suspicion is the amount of lobbying and pressure that can be put on by some very large amounts of capital coming into the country that is insistent on not necessarily move away the whole country from traditional coal and oil and gas, but certainly more focus, certainly on developing the data center space. I think the data center industry can really drive policy, and I'm relatively quietly optimistic that even in Indonesia that could happen.
I think that's a cue for the tech capital to invite us back next year so we can revisit this.
I said 4 or 5 years. I didn't say that.
I think I kind of sit somewhere in the middle on this, but I also think there is another aspect to this. We've heard many speakers talk about ESG and renewables on this panel, or at this conference, not just this panel. The reality, however, is that, you know, the new incoming administration in the US is actually very much focused on non-renewable energy, and they want to bring back coal, and they want to frack baby frack, right? So it is going to be, and also, you know, combined with the EPA unraveling and possibly complete dismantlement. I wonder just how much of the ESG drive that the large companies have, and this was, I mean, I'd like to put this question to Google and Microsoft, but, you know, how much of the drive towards ESG that the very large companies have put into their projected growth and investment in any region will actually, you know, remain once they do not have to comply with this, and it is actually a more expensive source of energy than perhaps coal, like it is in Indonesia, oil in the US, or even nuclear. So, you know, we already are seeing, somebody mentioned it yesterday, a nuclear SMR in Kentucky that's powering a data center there. Singapore is actually considering this very carefully as well at the moment. So there might be decentralization of nuclear power. I'm you know, not quite sure how I feel about that. Obviously this would be not necessarily in the hands of the government, and again, I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. But you know, it is on the cards, I think, now.
Yeah, I think nuclear is a really interesting one. My suspicion is it's at least 5 years away from anywhere in Asia being taken up. It raises lots of issues. I think I went to one of these conferences in Europe earlier this year and met the CEO of a company that produces these small facilities, and there's the size of a room, a nuclear kind of facility. And he's telling me the whole background of how safe it is. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating because if it does work and if governments can get their heads around the kind of the risk side of it, the kind of conceptual side of having a small nuclear reactor built in your country by someone who's manufacturing it from a country outside your country, that conceptually is very difficult. But if governments can get over that and it can be demonstrated to be safe, and it's a fantastic medium-term solution, the nuclear one. I don't think it's any time soon, though. And it is a shame. The US, there's no two ways about it. The world leadership that the US has provided as far as sustainability, renewable energy, that is going, and that's, we're going to have to wave goodbye to that without doubt for the next 4 years, if not more. The question is, has it got up enough head of steam so that it doesn't rely entirely on someone like the US to drive it? Do all the stakeholders now in the data center industry and other industries as well, do they now actually see that we don't need a policy telling us we've got to do this, we know we've got to do it, and it's a long-term kind of approach. I don't know the answer to that yet.
Or does indeed the application by the US of its position of leadership create a vacuum that someone else might step into?
Absolutely, and the obvious answer there is China. Is China going to say, fine, the US is not interested in promoting renewable energy? We will, and we've got the financial wherewithal to do that in Asia. We will support it. We will finance the development of renewable energy projects. We will finance the construction in a sustainable way of these data centers, and we will then step in and take the lead. And they may well do. I think it's quite possible.
And they have already announced that. I mean, that's their focus by the end of 2030, and EU is also looking to step up and fill the void. So, again, it's wait and see, huh?
Very interesting insights from the panel. We have a few more minutes before the end of the session. I'd like to open the discussion to the floor. Are there any questions from the audience for our panelists here? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming here. And I guess that wraps up the end of our session. Thank you.
Time for drinks.
Time for drinks.